Most people, if you ask them to name an American who saved thousands of lives in World War II, will say Eisenhower, maybe Patton, maybe a medic they remember from a documentary. Almost nobody says the name Charles Drew. And that's the whole problem, because Charles Drew didn't just save lives on one battlefield or in one campaign. He built the system that saved lives on every battlefield, in every campaign, for every Allied soldier who bled out in a field hospital, from the Pacific to North Africa to the beaches of Normandy. He invented, organized, and ran the modern blood bank. And then, the country he served told him his blood wasn't good enough to be in it. This is one of those stories where the more you dig into it, the harder it is to look away. It has genius, it has war, it has institutional cruelty, and it has a man who responded to all of it with more dignity than the system deserved. So let's go back to Washington, D.C., to a neighborhood called Foggy Bottom in the early years of the 20th century, and let me introduce you to one of the most important Americans you were never taught about. Charles Richard Drew was born on June 3, 1904, the eldest of 5 children. His father, Richard, was a carpet layer. His mother, Nora, had trained as a teacher. They were a middle-class black family in a city that was, by law and by custom, deeply segregated. Washington, D.C. operated under the shadow of Jim Crow in those years. Separate schools, separate hospitals, separate everything. But the Drew family raised their children with what you might call a quiet defiance through excellence. You will be better. You will work harder. You will not give the system an excuse to hold you back. Charles Drew took that instruction seriously from the beginning. He attended Dunbar High School, which at the time was one of the most academically rigorous black institutions in the country, a school that, in a different America, would have been called elite by any measure. The Evening Star newspaper, according to historical records, called him one of the greatest high school athletes in the country. And that wasn't an exaggeration. Football, basketball, track, swimming, Drew excelled at all of it. In 1922, he earned a partial athletic scholarship to Amherst College in Massachusetts. And here's where you start to see the character of the man. At Amherst, Drew was one of only a handful of black students in a predominantly white institution. He faced racial hostility, particularly from opposing teams during athletic competitions. His own football teammates passed him over for team captain his senior year, even though by most accounts, he was the best player on the roster. Drew didn't collapse. He didn't quit. He graduated in 1926 and immediately began laying the groundwork for medical school, spending 2 years at Morgan College in Baltimore, teaching chemistry and biology and coaching football, saving money. He applied to Howard University, applied to Harvard. Howard said he was missing some prerequisites. Harvard told him they'd like him to wait a year. So Drew, being exactly the kind of man he was, said, "Fine, I'll go to McGill University in Montreal instead," and he enrolled in one of Canada's most respected medical schools. He graduated in 1933 with his medical degree and Master of Surgery. And it was there, at McGill, working under a researcher studying blood transfusions and their relationship to shock, that Drew first glimpsed the problem he would spend his life solving. To understand why what Drew eventually accomplished was so revolutionary, you have to understand what the world of medicine looked like before he changed it. In the 1930s, if you needed a blood transfusion, the blood had to come from a donor who was physically present, ideally right there in the same room, or at least the same hospital. Blood went bad quickly. There was no reliable method to store it for more than a day or two. For military medicine, this was catastrophic. Soldiers were bleeding out in the field, not because no one had blood to give them, but because there was no system to get that blood from donors to patients across any meaningful distance or time frame. The problem wasn't generosity, it was logistics, chemistry, and preservation. Drew understood that the solution lay in plasma. Here's where the science matters, and I want to walk you through it because it's genuinely fascinating. Blood plasma is the liquid component of blood, the clear yellowish fluid that carries the red cells, white cells, and platelets. Researchers in the 1930s were beginning to understand that plasma, separated from the cellular components, had remarkable properties. It didn't require blood type matching. It could be given intravenously to almost any patient. It was effective at treating shock following trauma because it replenished blood volume and contained critical clotting factors. And this was the key insight that Drew pursued obsessively. Plasma could be preserved significantly longer than whole blood. When Drew arrived at Columbia University in 1938 on a Rockefeller Fellowship, working under Dr. John Scudder, he threw himself into the research. His doctoral thesis, which he would complete in 1940, was called Banked Blood, a Study on Blood Preservation. It was not an academic exercise. It was a blueprint for a system that didn't yet exist, but that the world was about to desperately need. Drew discovered that by separating plasma from the cellular elements through a process called deliquification, the shelf life could be extended dramatically, up to 2 months compared to the few days that whole blood could be stored. He studied anticoagulants, preservatives, container design, temperature requirements. He was building, piece by piece, the science of keeping blood alive outside a human body. He became the first African American to earn a Doctor of Science in Surgery from Columbia University. And then, just as he finished, Europe exploded into war. In the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany launched the Blitz against Britain. London was burning. British hospitals and military units were hemorrhaging casualties faster than their medical system could handle. And a group of New York's leading hospitals and researchers reached out to the obvious person. They asked Charles Drew to run a program called Blood for Britain. The Blood for Britain project was, by any reasonable standard, one of the most important humanitarian and medical operations of the early war years. Drew was tasked with organizing a system to recruit blood donors, collect blood from multiple hospitals using standardized procedures, separate and store the plasma, and ship it across the Atlantic to Britain. Nothing like this had ever been done at this scale. There was no playbook. Drew wrote it himself. He developed uniform procedures so that blood collected at different hospitals in different cities could be processed consistently. He built protocols for testing and packaging. The project, according to records cited by the National Archives, collected over 14,000 blood donations and sent 5,000 liters of plasma to Britain. British doctors used it to treat military and civilian casualties throughout the worst months of the Blitz. The project ran from August 1940 through January 1941, and it worked. It worked because Drew made it work. In January 1941, the U.S. government, with America not yet in the war but clearly preparing, asked the National Research Council and the American Red Cross to establish a national blood program. There was exactly one person they could turn to lead it. Charles Drew became the director of the first American Red Cross blood bank. And here is where the story turns. Here is where you have to sit with what America did next. The U.S. military, in a directive that stunned many people in the medical and scientific community, initially excluded blood donations from African American donors entirely. Let that land for a moment. The man who built the system, who had spent years developing the science, who had run Blood for Britain, who was the foremost authority on blood preservation in the country, was now running a blood bank that by military order would not accept blood from people who looked like him. Drew himself could not donate to his own creation. Under pressure from the black press and from organizations like the NAACP, the policy was modified in January 1942, but not eliminated. The American Red Cross announced it would now accept blood from black donors, but would store it separately. Segregated blood, as if the plasma of a black American soldier would contaminate a white soldier, as if the science Drew had spent his career building didn't apply to his own people. Drew was unequivocal in his response. He objected publicly and on the record. in a letter written in 1944 to the director of the Federal Labor Standards Association, a letter that has been preserved and cited by the National World War II Museum. Drew wrote that the Army had made what he called a grievous mistake, a stupid error, and that there was no scientific basis for the order whatsoever. He said it plainly: there is no scientific basis for the order. They need the blood. He resigned from his position. He would not be the face of a system built on a lie his own research had disproven. And here's what gets me every time I read about this. Drew didn't leave medicine. He didn't walk away in bitterness. He went back to Howard University, back to Friedman's Hospital, and he spent the rest of his life doing what he believed was his most important work, training black surgeons. He became head of the Department of Surgery at Howard and chief of surgery at Friedman's. He mentored students. He fought for the inclusion of black physicians in mainstream medical institutions that had long excluded them. He became the first black surgeon selected to serve as an examiner on the American Board of Surgery. He received the NAACP Spingarn Medal in 1944, one of the most prestigious honors in African American life. He was elected a Fellow of the International College of Surgeons. He was appointed surgical consultant to the U.S. Army's European Theater of Operations in 1949. The institution that had told him his blood wasn't good enough eventually came back and asked for his expertise. He gave it because that was who he was. On April 1, 1950, Charles Drew was driving through North Carolina on his way to a medical conference at Tuskegee with 3 colleagues in the car. He fell asleep at the wheel. The car went off the road. Drew's injuries were catastrophic. He was taken to Alamance General Hospital, where doctors worked to save him. He died from his injuries at the age of 45. Now, almost immediately after his death, a story began to circulate, and it spread widely, repeated in newspapers, and eventually even dramatized on television, that Drew had been refused a blood transfusion because of his race, and that this had killed him. It's a story that feels true because it was not at all rare for Black Americans to be turned away from white hospitals in the South. The story resonated because the system it described was real, even if this specific instance was not. But the historical record is clear. It didn't happen that way. Dr. Walter Johnson, one of the physicians who was in the car with Drew, provided a detailed eyewitness account, later published in the Journal of the National Medical Association, describing the treatment Drew received and the severity of his injuries. According to Ford, one of the other passengers, Drew's injuries were so severe that virtually nothing could have saved him. The myth has been thoroughly examined and debunked by historians, including in a book called One Blood: The Death and Resurrection of Charles R. Drew by researcher Spency Love. Drew's daughter, Charlene Drew Jarvis, who served on the D.C. Council, addressed the myth directly in a 1996 article. The irony is painful. A false story about one injustice became so widespread that it partially obscured the true injustice, which was bad enough on its own and didn't need embellishment. Because the true story, the actual documented, verifiable story is this: a black man from Washington, D.C., in a country that told him at every turn what he couldn't do, went ahead and built one of the most important medical systems in modern history. He organized the blood programs that kept Allied soldiers alive in World War II. He developed the protocols and preservation techniques that every blood bank on Earth still builds on today. He invented the Blood Mobile, the mobile donation station that you've probably seen parked outside a shopping center or a church, where people quietly show up to give an hour of their time and a pint of their blood. That was Drew's idea. And then, the country he served told him his blood wasn't fit to be stored alongside white blood. He said that was scientifically wrong, morally wrong, and institutionally shameful. He was right on all 3 counts. He resigned his directorship in protest, and then he went back to work, training the next generation of surgeons, because he understood that the fight wasn't over and the work still needing doing. In 1981, the United States Postal Service issued a postage stamp in his honor, part of the Great American series. The Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science in Los Angeles bears his name. Schools, medical centers, and public buildings across the country are named for him. The National Historic Landmark designation was given to the house he lived in during his youth in Arlington, Virginia. These are good things, but I keep thinking about the long gap between what this man did and what this country acknowledged. The gap between the science he built and the policy it refused to change until 1950, the same year he died. The American Red Cross maintained its segregated blood policy until 1950. Drew never saw it end. What I want you to take from this story is something specific, because I think it matters for how we understand American history. The story of Charles Drew is not a story about an exceptional person who overcame adversity, as if the adversity were some neutral force of nature. The adversity was a policy, the deliberate, institutionalized policy that told a man his blood wasn't good enough for the system his mind had built, and he pushed back.
He said so, clearly and on the record, and then he got on with his work. That's not just inspiration, that's a specific kind of American stubbornness, a refusal to let the system's failure become your failure. And the system's failure was undeniable. The science was on his side. It had always been on his side. Plasma doesn't have a race. Blood type exists. Blood group exists. Race does not exist in blood. Drew knew that. He built his career proving it, and he stood in front of the institutions of his own country and said, "I have the data. I am right, and you are wrong." He was. Every time someone in this country sits down at a blood drive, every time a soldier gets a transfusion in the field, every time an accident victim in an emergency room gets plasma while the trauma team works, they are benefiting from what Charles Drew figured out in a laboratory at Columbia University and put into practice during the worst years of the Second World War. The number of lives saved by the blood banking system he helped build is, as historians and medical scholars note, genuinely beyond counting. The system has been running for more than 80 years. The lives saved are in the millions, maybe far beyond that. And most people, most Americans, have no idea his name. That's the part that should bother us. Not as a political point, not as a culture war argument, but as a simple matter of honoring what this country has actually produced. We built something remarkable in Charles Drew. The least we can do is remember it. So I want to ask you something in the comments. Did you know who Charles Drew was before today? And if you didn't, where do you think you should have learned about him? In school? In a museum? Somewhere else? I'm curious where this lands for people, because I think the answer says something about how we teach American history and who gets centered in that telling. If this story is new to you, share it. Send it to someone, because stories like this don't spread on their own. They need people who care about real history to carry them forward. That's the whole point of what we're doing here. There's a lot more where this came from. Next time, we're gonna dig into another American story that almost nobody knows, and I promise you, it's gonna hit just as hard. If you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time. I'll see you in the next one.